The barn door groaned open, its hinges screaming into the frozen night. Samuel Boone raised his lantern, his other hand gripping the rifle tightly. He was prepared for a stray animal or a fallen beam. But the trembling light found no animal eyes. It fell upon a scene that made him freeze. An unconscious woman and 7 children huddled in the cold straw. Staring back at him from the shadows were the eyes of a little girl, a silent, pleading gaze. In that instant, Samuel knew the problem. In his barn couldn't be solved with a bullet, but with a choice that would change everything. The oil lamp on the table flickered, its meager halo of light struggling to push the congealing darkness from the 4 corners of the world Samuel called home. Outside, the sky was shedding a white curtain of snow, each flake a silent whisper. From heaven, piling up on the eaves and blanketing the path to the barn. Inside, the hearth had died down. The evening meal sat untouched on the table, long since grown cold, and the oaken rocking chair creaked with the steady rhythm of his breathing. Samuel had stopped expecting change 2 winters ago, the day he had laid his life's companion to rest in the earth beneath the sycamore tree that come spring had refused to bloom. Since then, life on the ranch ran on a silent and precise track, feeding the old horse in its stall, splitting dry logs for the day to come, and drinking the black, strong coffee from a worn iron mug. The chicken coop was now empty, no clucking to be heard, no one to grumble about the flour or to share stories from town. There was only the ranch and its stubborn silence. That night, it was a sound that pulled him from his stillness. A sound that did not belong to the night. It was not the shriek of the wind, not the cracking of wood, nor the slip of snow from the roof. It was a heavy, dull thud, as if the earth itself had just shifted in pain. He reached for the lamp and the rifle, and stepped out into the blue-black frost, where breath turned to fog and the sky pressed down like a heavy woolen blanket. Snow crunched under his boots, each step careful, steady. When he pushed open the barn door, its hinges sang a mournful song of rust, and the lamplight illuminated shapes that did not belong there. There they were, huddled in the darkness at the foot of the loft ladder, small shapes pressed together like a brood of fledglings before a storm. 7 children, huddled close to a woman who lay motionless, her back against a wooden post. She did not move, save for the faint rise and fall of her chest and the cracked lips that parted with each breath. Blood had darkened the sleeve of her dress. A black stain on the worn fabric dot one of the children. A girl with dark braids and eyes that held a maturity beyond her years, looked up and met his gaze directly. Her eyes held no fear, nor any plea, only a weary resolve. "Please, sir, don't," she whispered, and nothing more dot in that moment. The rifle in Samuel's hands suddenly felt heavy and meaningless. The lamp in his hand trembled, its shifting light sketching a scene from a holy book. A tattered woman surrounded by shivering children. Snow from a hole in the roof dusting her shoulders like ash on a mourner's coat. Her feet were bare, without a word. He silently shrugged off his thick woolen coat. He stepped forward, his initial hesitation gone, and gently draped it over the woman's form. Just then, the youngest boy began to cry, a choked sob as if he had held it back for too long and had finally reached his limit. The older girl whispered, "Shoo," her hand stroking his hair. Samuel knelt beside the woman, touching her hot forehead. "A fever, but she's alive," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "There's a fire in the house. It's warmer there." No one moved. He turned, leaving the lamp for them, and walked back alone through the snow. He entered the house, stoked the embers in the hearth until the fire roared high, and put a kettle of water on the stove. He cut thick slices of bread, spreading upon them the last of the apple preserve that Eliza, his wife, had made the autumn before. Then he sat down and waited. And they came. Not all at once, but silently, one by one, like specters testing the threshold of a sacred place. The girl with the Braids led the way, her chin held high, guiding the woman into the house. Samuel did not help, not because he was unwilling, but because he understood the sanctity of dignity, and how easily it could be shattered by the weight of pity. One by one, they curled up by the warm fire, the youngest asleep before the warmth had even touched him. The woman was placed on Samuel's small cot. He stood by the door, his hands clasped, the fire crackling between them like a barrier of untold stories. The rifle remained above the mantelpiece, cold and untouched. That night, the house was no longer empty. When the dew was still on the wooden fences and the dawn was only a silver-gray blush, Samuel was already outside. The old horse in the barn nickered softly as he passed. And there, beneath a crossbeam, he saw the cause of the previous night's sound. Rainwater had rotted the timber through many seasons, and a part of the roof had collapsed, dragging a pile of cold snow inside with it. "Have to fix this," he murmured to himself. Before breakfast, the sound of a hammer rang out in the quiet morning air. Each strike, dry and decisive, echoed into the frosty dawn. It was not the sound of destruction, but of mending, of fortifying a shelter. When he returned to the house, the woman was awake. She was limping, but her posture was straight, carefully feeding spoonfuls of thin broth to the smallest child with a wooden spoon. She did not look at Samuel as he entered, only said softly, "Thank you." He set his tools down. "What is your name?" She hesitated, as if speaking her own name was a dangerous act. "Nora." He waited. "Some are kin," she continued, her eyes never leaving the children. "The others, they just followed me on the road. 7 is a heavy burden." She smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. "But they are still lighter than loneliness." Samuel felt something stir in his chest, not pity nor desire. It was a deep recognition. He offered her a mug of hot water with a few peels of lemon. "I am Samuel Boone. You can stay here until the storm passes." The girl with the braids, perhaps 12 years old, had been watching everything from a corner of the room. She spoke, her voice clear. "We have heard men say things like that before." Samuel met her gaze. "I reckon you'll soon know if my words are true." The girl nodded once, sharply. A truce. By noon, Nora was using a rag she had stitched back together to wipe the floors. The children were playing with a few wooden animals that Samuel had packed away long ago. Bursts of laughter, clear and tentative, floated up and filled the empty space of the house. He did not join in, only stood on the porch, sipping his now cold coffee. His thoughts tangled like an old rope. That night he laid more blankets by the hearth. The cot remained hers. The children slept in a heap, their limbs tangled, their heads nestled together like a nest of birds. And as Samuel lay down on the floor, his back to the door, he realized the house was no longer an empty shell. It was stirring, like the first chapter of a story just beginning. The house had found its own rhythm, a rhythm slow and steady as an unsung hymn. Mornings no longer began with silence, but with the sound of embers being stirred, the soft clink of tin cups, the patter of children's bare feet hurrying across the cold pine floors. Nora moved through that space with a quiet precision, always favoring one leg slightly as she swept or folded a blanket. She kept a constant eye on the youngest, who clung to her skirt like a second shadow. Samuel had his own rituals. He split more wood than was necessary, left the coffee pot on the stove always full, and placed the broom right by the door so she could reach it without having to bend. She never asked, and he never insisted, but they communicated through glances that met for a moment, heavy with things that courtesy alone could not express. He noticed the way she would refold a quilt twice, when she thought no one was watching. She noticed the way he would turn the wedding band on his finger when he stood lost in thought for too long. They were still strangers, bound together by the fragile thread of decency, That evening's meal was just potatoes boiled with onion, without a grain of salt. Nora served the soup without a word, her lips pressed tightly together. Samuel tasted. It swallowed and said only, "Warmth in the belly is a good thing." She sat last after the children had eaten their fill, then spooned the small remainder into her own bowl, but did not touch it. The freckled boy Jed watched her from across the table. "Is there no salt here either?" Nora's voice became firm. "Do not complain." Samuel leaned back slowly. "There is salt." "I was the one who forgot." The boy looked at him. "You forget a lot of things, don't you?" "I only remember what is worth remembering." Silence fell over the table. Outside, the wind teased the eaves, and inside, the fire crackled like bone under too much weight. Nora's eyes rested on the soup pot for a long while before she stood and carried it to the wash basin. She did not cry, but her hands were trembling. The next morning, Samuel found her kneeling by the hearth, scrubbing at the soot-blackened bricks with a rag no bigger than her palm. Her bandaged hand was pressing down too hard. He set down the bucket he was carrying. "You don't need to do all this." She kept scrubbing. "I have to. Why?" She looked up, her eyes meeting his, clear and resolute. "Because when a place is clean, it doesn't feel borrowed." The change at Samuel's ranch could not remain a secret forever. It began with Mrs. Agatha Winslow, when she caught sight of the children's mismatched socks hanging on Samuel's fence, like the tattered flags of some scandalous new nation. She squinted, her lips pursed like the string around a gift she was eager to deliver. A gift wrapped in judgment. By evening, the story had spread to the feed store through the blacksmith's daughter. He's housing a woman and 7 children, as if his home were a sanctuary. The banker's wife added her own embellishments, saying the woman was barefoot, and that she had seen the youngest child carrying firewood like a servant. The town, which had forgotten Samuel for 2 years, now remembered his name in unison: Pastor Silas Harper, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes, received 3 letters that week, all expressing concern over the moral temperature of the Boone household. He read them by lamplight, folded them neatly, and said nothing. But Samuel felt the stares when he went to town for supplies. He heard the whispers behind prayer-clasped hands at the general store. No one said it outright, but every glance carried the weight of what people thought they would do better, if grief had not made them so self-righteously correct. One afternoon, upon returning home, he found Nora sitting on the porch, mending a boot with a thread drawn through the eye of her rusted needle. Her knuckles were raw from scrubbing. "There was a woman in town," she said without looking up. "She turned her face away when I passed." He sat down beside her. "Mrs. Winslow thinks God watches through curtains." Nora let out a faint, weak laugh. "She's wrong. God watches through eyes like yours. The eyes of quiet men who let strangers sleep under their roofs." Samuel did not reply. He watched her fingers work the boot leather, slow and stubborn. A long silence passed. It was she who broke it with a question that was not truly a question. "I will leave when the snow melts." He nodded, though something inside him recoiled at the thought. "You don't have to go." She continued her stitching. "You will want to marry again." "I already did," he said. "She is in the ground." That was the end of it. The thread in her hand snapped. Inside the house, one of the children began to sing, a wandering, wordless tune of hums and sighs and the occasional call for Mama. Nora's eyes glistened, but she blinked it away and stood up. Later, he found her in the barn, tending to the children's makeshift sleeping area. They had turned old wooden crates into beds, lining them with dry straw for warmth, and had used tattered blankets to create a patchwork curtain to block the wind. It was not comfort, but it was order, an order created from nothing. The girl with the braids approached him. "My mother says we will leave soon, but we have nowhere else to go." She looked up at him, her gaze searching. The people in town don't want us here." He looked down at the face that had already learned to hide its emotions. "Do you think I want you to go?" She hesitated. "I don't know. I am not the town." "But you are only one man," Samuel nodded. "Sometimes one person is enough." She said nothing more, only returned to her work. That evening's meal was more substantial. The soup was thick with flour, and Samuel had not forgotten the salt. The children noticed. They said nothing, but they scraped their bowls clean. One of the boys even mumbled a clumsy thank you. Nora smiled faintly. "His name is Samuel," she told the children. It was the first time she had spoken his name. After the meal, Samuel stepped out onto the porch, watching the stars bloom over the hills. The frost bit sharper now, but something in the air had shifted. She joined him, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "You have been kind," she said. He nodded. "You have been strong." She looked out at the bare trees beyond the fence. "My family did not want me," she whispered. "They said I was bad luck. They said anyone who gathers strays deserves the life they get." "Then I suppose we deserve each other," he replied. She let out a laugh, a sudden startled sound, then quickly clapped a hand over her mouth as if she had committed a forbidden act. But it was real, and it left a touch of color on her cheeks. He looked at her then, truly looked, and he no longer saw the wounds or the weight, but the woman, upright and unbroken, holding together what the world had torn apart. As she turned to go inside, she paused. "Do you miss her?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "But missing does not mean there is nothing left." She nodded once, then softly closed the door. That night, when the house was quiet, Samuel walked to the chair where her tattered dress was hanging. Beside it, he placed a square of folded blue cloth. It was Eliza's, the one she always wore when she planted beans. He said nothing, only left it there, a silent offering in the night. The next morning she wore it. The blue dress, faded but clean, did not fit perfectly, but it fit her. The children were the first to notice. "You look like a lady in a picture book," the youngest declared. The girl with the braids smiled then, reached into her cloth satchel and pulled out a necklace made of stars pressed from flattened tin. "We have a gift for you too." Nora took the gift in both hands. "It's beautiful." "It is not silver," the girl said, a little shyly. "No," Nora replied, "it is more precious." She turned to Samuel, her eyes glistening with something close to peace. "Thank you." He only nodded. Words would have made the moment smaller. He watched her move through the room with a new stillness, not because fear had vanished, but because she had created a home for herself in spite of it. And that, he realized, was the beginning of healing. But the wind changed direction before the sun could climb higher. It blew down from the slope, sharp and cold, carrying the scent of dust and the strong smell of horses. Samuel stopped mid-stride in the yard, one hand on the fence, the other still clutching a tin pail. A sense of unease spread through the air, a warning of something not yet seen. By the time he reached the porch, the dog had begun to growl, a low rumble in its chest. The children, who had been chasing each other around the yard, froze in place like deer that had scented danger. Nora emerged from the barn doorway, her hands still dusted with flour, and the color drained from her face. He followed her gaze. A man was riding down from the ridge, flanked by two other shadows in old wool coats. The lead rider sat high in his saddle with a loud and arrogant posture, leaning heavily as if the very land owed him the trouble of bearing his weight. His voice tore through the quiet before he even drew near. "I thought I'd find you here, Nora." "Go inside," Samuel said softly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Get the children inside." Nora, her face pale, wordlessly herded her children indoors. Only the girl with the braids hesitated for a beat, her eyes locked on the approaching men. Then she too turned and went. Samuel stepped down from the porch just as the man dismounted. tossing the reins aside as if he had never cared for securing anything properly. He approached, bringing with him the smell of tobacco and cheap whiskey. His hand rested on the butt of a gleaming pistol. "Well," he said, looking Samuel up and down. "Aren't you the collector of strays?" Samuel did not answer. "Are you feeding my brother's property?" "I don't feed property," Samuel said, his voice low and even. "I only feed people." The man, Isaac, let out a harsh laugh. "She's not a person. She's a curse in a righteous cloak, always pretending to be pure while taking what isn't hers. She left. She ran." Isaac roared. "And every place she lands, something goes missing. Money, food, or a little decency. She brought life here." Samuel answered, "She brought filth." That word broke like glass. Samuel took a step forward, and for the first time, Isaac's hand tightened on his pistol. The other two men fanned out, circling like wolves. "Touch that gun," Samuel warned, "and I will bury you with it." The silence was broken by footsteps. Pastor Silas Harper was walking up the path, calm in his old vestments and work boots. "Gentlemen," he said. Isaac scoffed. "I didn't come here for a sermon." "Then you have come to the wrong house," the pastor replied. "This is not about God. This is about decency." Isaac stepped back, calculating. "I came for what is mine. And you think screaming in front of children, with a pistol on your hip, makes you right?" Nora's voice rang out from behind them. "Isaac, go home. You still think you have a voice?" He snarled at her. "They followed me because I fed them," Nora said, her voice now clear and strong, "and because I never raised a hand to them." "You have 5 seconds to leave," Samuel repeated. Isaac hesitated. And then the door opened again. One by one, they came out. The 7 children, not crying, not hiding. They stood in a line beside Nora, their small shoulders held straight. The girl with the braids walked over and stood beside Samuel, her chin high. They were a silent army. "What is this supposed to mean?" Isaac stammered. "It means they have chosen," Pastor Harper said. "Do you wish to make them orphans once more?" "No," Samuel said. "I wish to give them a home." Isaac stared at them. His nostrils flared. Then he spat on the ground. He climbed onto his horse, his eyes blazing. "You will regret this," he said to Samuel. "No," Nora answered for him. "He is kind. That is something a man like you would never recognize." He yanked the reins and rode off, the dust rising like a final curse. When the sound of hoofbeats had faded, Samuel turned. Nora stood there, her shoulders slumped, trembling. He said nothing, only walked to her, placed a hand on her shoulder, and stood there until her breathing slowed. "He used to beat his own brother," she whispered. "When I stopped him, they both turned on me." She looked up at him, tears finally streaming down her face. "Now I am free." He nodded. "Yes, you are free." The next morning, with the frost still on the grass, Nora found him by the well. "If you were to ask," she said, her voice as soft as a breath, "I would not run again." He only looked at her, then kissed the crown of her head. Their wedding took place at noon under the repaired roof of the barn. The whole town came, not because the church bell rang, but because the whispers had now turned to a quiet, shamefaced curiosity. Mrs. Winslow brought a loaf of cornbread. Pastor Harper stood before them. Nora wore the blue dress. Samuel wore his old coat. Their vows were not of flowery words, but of the recognition that one soul had found shelter in another. That evening, they sat on the porch, his wife resting her head on his shoulder. The word wife felt right. "We will bury it," he said, holding a scrap of tattered fabric from her old dress, "under the sycamore tree. Not to forget, but to begin again." And so they did, under a sky full of stars. That night, lying beneath a single quilt, she whispered, "Do you think the world will remember us?" Samuel kissed her wrist. "No," he said. "But the children will." She smiled in the darkness. That is enough. And somewhere between midnight and morning, between what was and what could now be, the sun began to climb the ridge, soft and gentle, as if it, too, did not wish to disturb the beginning of a gentler story.